name is Ping Ponampai Narenpitak. I am a climate scientist from Thailand. Currently, I'm working on regional impacts of solar radiation modification in Thailand and the neighboring countries or ocean surfaces areas. Okay, I'm a little excited and nervous at the same time to be a MC this morning. And before we begin, I also would like to share with you about the next very exciting conference on climate engineering, and it is about, it's the Gordon Research Conference, which will be held in May in the United States next year. Our co-chairs of the GRC next year are also here at this conference, Michael Diamond and Lily Sia. So please feel free to talk to them, or Dan Visioni and myself. Dan and I are the co-vice chair of the GRC. This coming GRC will be very exciting because we will be bridging all the gaps, or hopefully, bridging the gaps between observations, model, and impacts. And we will be fostering interdisciplinary collaborations and research. So I hope that all of you here can make it there. Also, a little bit about myself and degrees. My team and I from Thailand, we received the Degrees Modeling Fund since 2023, looking at SRM impacts. And yeah, we are very excited to be here. And I am sure you are excited about today's sessions as well. So a little bit of an overview. We will start off with a plenary session this morning, followed by more introductions of the new initiatives, the Global North edition. Then there will be a parallel session and a poster session, and then, a parallel session again. Actually, poster first, here, right next to this room, followed by a parallel session, lunch, and another parallel session. Everything will end a bit early today at 3:30 because of a conference dinner, and you can follow the agenda online. I also was asked to remind you about the survey that Andy talked about yesterday. How many of you have done the survey? If you could, yay, thank you. Well, for the rest of you, it takes only 2 or 3 minutes, and the QR code is here or on the chairs in this room and everywhere in this conference venue. So please take the time to complete it before 7 p.m. tonight so that tomorrow we can hear the results of the survey in the afternoon. I'm sure you are excited for the first plenary session today, and the title of the session is Fitting Solar Radiation Modification into the Wider Landscape. This is pretty much a conversation about how solar radiation modification fits into other studies like carbon dioxide removal or direct air capture, also climate adaptation and emission reductions. Our moderator of this session, Holly Buck, will be here to guide the conversation. Holly is a professor from the University of Buffalo. With that, I would like to hand the mic to Holly for the next plenary session.
Thank you so much. So today we're going to talk about how SRM fits into the wider climate action landscape. We've had conversations about this already over the past few days, but here's a chance to dive a little bit deeper. And for this conversation, I'm pleased to introduce 2 amazing speakers. Rose Mutiso is the executive director at the African Tech Futures Lab. And we also have with us David Keith, professor of geophysical science at the University of Chicago. And so what we're going to do for this session, we're going to have a mediated interaction. By that I mean we have an initial quiz. This is different than the survey, so please also fill out the survey. Consider this a warm-up if you haven't done the survey already. But we're going to use Slido for this session. First, we're going to do a short quiz exercise. Then we're going to have a back and forth with Rose and David. And then we should have plenty of time for questions. We are also going to use this app for questions. So If you have a question, ask it early in the app. You can do it anonymously. You can put your name on it, in which case we can give the mic to you. You can also upvote and downvote questions. So with that, let's get it started. This is kind of a warm-up. Give everybody a chance to enter the space, the digital space. So I can see we have a high bar of keeping everybody energized and awake this morning. I think we knew that. We will try to make it spicy. Would you like some water?
No, thanks. Good. Aerosolized. I want to actually grab more coffee.
Suspiciously awake. That's a bit mysterious. Okay, so in the interest of time, we will, although as a sociologist, I'm very interested in this. Let's get into talking about climate action. And we'll just go through, it's about, 5, 6, 7 questions. The first one being, what do you think CO2 emissions will be in 2050? So we have a figure that shows the historical trajectory here. 4 different ranges. Do you think, A, they will be more than today, more than 40 billion tons? B, slightly less, 25 to 40 billion tons, or B, and then C, and then D, getting towards these goals we've set forward. And we will show the answers to these as we move through the conversation. Seems like we have a critical mass of votes on that one. The next question is about carbon removal, something we'll touch on in this conversation. What is the likelihood that permanent carbon removal will have increased through our efforts to intentionally deploy carbon removal to over 1 billion tons of CO2 per year? CDR is the acronym for carbon removal. In 2050. Again, we obviously know that our forests and some ecosystems are removing carbon. In this question, we're talking about through intentional effort. So people sometimes talk about different pillars of climate response, mitigation being first and foremost, carbon removal for the last 10% or so, that's a matter of debate. Adaptation is obviously critical, so we have a couple of questions about that as well. the next one being, what do you think the effectiveness of adaptation should and when we reach 2 degrees Celsius would be? Do you think it would be pretty good with climate impacts, not much more than what we're seeing today, which is also obviously horrible for a lot of people, but good relative to where we could be. Not so good impacts with a lot worse than today's, or basically catastrophic to the point where social natural systems are unable to respond. Okay. And then we come to a couple of questions about the topic at hand in this conference, solar geoengineering. Which would you say best represents your views about this right now? That solar geoengineering, solar radiation modification, is more likely to lead to burdens on adaptation because it would introduce new risks and increase vulnerability and impacts? Or do you think it's more likely to make adaptation easier through slowing warming, reducing vulnerability and impacts? So how are you seeing the interaction between these right now? Another SRM question for you. In your work, how do you tend to communicate the role of SRM in climate response when you're talking to people about what you do if you work on SRM, or if you're in a position to talk about it? Do you say, SRM must not affect or slow action on mitigation? Or would you say SRM could allow more time for slower mitigation? And finally, final question related to the last one. Thinking about your response to that question about slowing action on mitigation, would you say this messaging point that you talked about accurately reflects your inner feelings about how you actually see the role of SRM in climate response? So in reference to your previous answer. All right. So we're gonna, oh, we've already got 10 new questions. I promise we will get to this. But I want to start out by talking about rapid decarbonization and thinking about where these emissions would be and where we're headed. This is kind of how the room is feeling right now, a range of answers. A lot of people are concerned. I can see that we will not reach these net zero goals. But I want to start by talking with you, Rose, since this is the area you work on with energy systems. What would it mean to do rapid decarbonization, especially in the context of the developing world? Can you sketch that out for us? What are the challenges and opportunities that you're seeing?
Yeah, so I like to say that climate policy is just essentially now energy policy, for better or worse. And that's the space that I'm in. And so obviously the energy space is where a lot of the action on decarbonization will be. It's biggest source of emissions, and also decarbonizing energy will have spillover to other sectors. So spoiler, energy kind of is the flag bearer for this, but we're not going to meet net zero, so we kind of are resigned to that right now. And I think what, though, you often hear, I think this is kind of mixed messaging, because on one hand, we're not meeting net zero and we're not decarbonizing at pace, but we also hear a lot of the success stories. And this is especially in the power sector where I come from. So you've no doubt heard about, we're building solar and wind at pace. I think over 90% of new power system capacity additions in the world are from solar and wind. We're expecting that those will approach 50% of the energy mix, of the power sector mix by 2030. And so this is big progress. And it's important to note that energy is one piece of the pie, but the biggest piece. And then the power sector is a sub-piece of energy. And so all of these stories that we hear are in the power sector. But cleaning up the power sector is important. So it's not the full picture, but it's important. And especially as we have record temperatures, we need more cooling. As we're electrifying all of these other end users in transport and industry, whatever. So I think the success stories that we hear about what's happening in the power sector are not the complete picture, but it is an important piece of the puzzle. So it's not a complete, we're not obscuring by focusing on that. So just a bit, because you kind of wanted me to ask to add texture on the developing country piece. So developing countries do matter in this case. So energy demand is growing fastest in the developing countries. And in 2024, developing countries accounted for 80% of energy demand growth. So most rich countries, the energy demand is kind of plateauing, maybe declining slightly. We're seeing a bit of a spike now, slight growth, but really it's all in developing countries. But developing countries are not the same. You have China on one end, and then you have like a small country like, say, Gabon or whatever, like a small African country at the other end, and these are all kind of lumped together. So, developing countries are really important for demand growth, but there's a lot of variation amongst them. What would it mean to decarbonize, especially in developing countries where all of the demand growth is? But just in general, so obviously electrification. So electrification is where the action is where the attention is, so kind of moving end users into electricity. There's a lot of conversation about hard-to-abate sectors, aviation, you name it, certain parts of industry. So you've probably all heard the script. So what I think is really the important texture I would like this room to have about the usual list of things that we hear need to happen for decarbonization is, one, decarbonization has to align with development, because if a lot of the energy demand growth is in developing countries that are still trying to grow, are still trying to deliver opportunity, then you really need to minimize the conflict between growth and climate and development and climate. So that's kind of one tension that's really important. That's driving a lot of conversation in my space. And then the second big one is obviously, and we've heard this in previous panels, including the plenary yesterday, the evening plenary is just finance and investment. I think that's it. So those are kind of the two sticking points is how do you align development, growth, and these climate goals, especially in developing countries, and then how do you fund it? The last thing I just want to say, which it put up another point underlined, which also came up yesterday, is very, very poor countries, like in most of sub-Saharan Africa, if you remove South Africa, for example, they're not contributed so little to the problem, and I think really need to be treated as a special case and kind of be allowed to grow and kind of have much more flexibility.
Yeah. David, I'm curious how you're thinking about the decarbonization puzzle, and if you're up for sharing your answer to this question.
Yeah, I'm more optimistic than many. Like, if thinking about the plenaries yesterday, we heard that emissions are rising fast and sort of idea that it's a failure and we're going to blow through 2 degrees. And my perspective is different. I think the world is at a turning point, not metaphorically, but literally, in the sense that this is a good chance that this is the year or next year where emissions peak. Might not be true, but just to be clear, that's what most of the forecasters say. So the International Energy Agency or Rystad Energy or McKinsey or DNV, all of these are predicting a peak basically this year. Next year, they could be wrong, but I doubt they'll be wrong by that much. And there's been this extraordinary growth in the money and capital and effort flowing into decarbonization. So the world is now spending, last year spent $2 trillion on clean energy, a little under 2% of the global economy. And that number, which I think is the sort of most basic metric of the pace of action, has gone up very quickly. Through a lot of the first decade and a half of this century, that number was around 300 billion. That number, by the way, is now 4 or 5 times larger last year, or last couple year average, than the flow of money into upstream oil and gas. And so I regard this as really a success in some profound ways. And I want to step back maybe to communicate that, because I guess most of you don't think that, and give you like a long perspective. So a quarter millennia ago, Watt invented a better steam engine, which was used to pump water out of coal mines, and you can't think of a better definition of a chain reaction. So you've made a more efficient way to pump water out of mines so you can mine faster, and that's the Industrial Revolution. And now, a quarter century later, we're probably at a point where emissions stop growing and begin to decline, and economic growth keeps going. And I think that is a big deal and an important thing. It doesn't mean the climate fight is over. Absolutely not, because danger is proportional to cumulative emissions. We have to get emissions to net zero if we want a stable climate. It's math. And I think we will get emissions to net zero. But I think this is one of the great turning points. And I've been working on this topic since the late 80s, and I think people should be more conscious of that amazing success.
David, I didn't expect you to be more optimistic than me. This is a
Okay.
surprise.
All right.
But I think with the investment, I agree with all of that. But 2/3 of that investment is going to advanced economies and China. So I just think that the distribution effects, which this for me is always a sticking point. And so where are we putting the money? Is it in the right places?
Totally agree. The one last point I was going to make was this, like, as much as this is a success, the deep injustice of climate change remains. The fact that there's, that the harms of climate change fall mostly on hotter and older people in hot people in hot countries, in poor countries, especially the old. Those are the ones who are dying most from high temperatures. And the emissions, as we all know, come almost completely from the developed world. So that injustice is gigantic, and there's not signs of it changing the way it should.
Well, let's switch to talking about carbon removal a bit, because people have thought about that as part of the piece that we need to start working on now to deal with the last bit of emissions. And we'll show how people in this room are thinking about it. So we're kind of divided on how we'll, what this is looking like. But carbon removal, I think, is really instructive for this field of SRM at this moment, just looking at how that moved from the scientific community 10 years ago, when it was kind of an artifact in integrated assessment models, to being a field of practice that people got excited about actually doing. We could take a moment to reflect on that. I'm going to keep on moving because we have so many questions piling up. But I do think that it's a hard time right now because we had this burst of enthusiasm, 2020, 2021, net zero goals, set the narrative frame, the targets for carbon removal, opened up space for governments to start talking about more opened up space for investors and, to think about it. And then we had this pullback, not just with carbon removal, but with climate tech more generally in some areas like hydrogen, carbon capture, and so on, with this changing landscape, inflation, war. And so, David, you've worked on this for a very long time. How are you thinking about the prospects for large-scale carbon removal right now?
So it's been kind of fun for me because during the years that I was involved with that startup company, Carbon Engineering, I didn't do academic work on carbon removal, tried to really not to try and minimize conflict of interest. And the last couple of years, now that I'm not involved with carbon engineering, it's been really fun. So I'm kind of diving in, and there's a whole lot of stuff happening at University of Chicago that I'm really excited about. And I've been writing a book a lot of last year. It's been my focus, and I've been sort of struggling as the book writing process to try and summarize a big view. And the summary that I won't take the time to defend here, but I think is defensible, is that humans could remove 1,000 gigatons of carbon in a century at a cost of less than 1% of the economy. And I think you can defend the idea that that could be done without any technological breakthroughs, with foreseeable applications of existing technology. And I think that's a big deal. I have no idea whether people will do that, but I think that means that we could, as a species, kind of build the time machine. We could actually pull carbon back and head back towards pre-industrial. For reference, cumulative emissions are 2,500 gigatons CO2 roughly. So, I think the idea that over a century and a half or longer, humans could really bring carbon concentrations back towards the pre-industrial, if we choose to, is to me a really profoundly optimistic idea. And I think 1% of the economy is something that people could afford for protecting the natural environment. Again, who knows whether they will. We'll get to this later, I guess, but I think it's crucial to say, my view is that we shouldn't be doing large-scale carbon removal now. We shouldn't really put much effort into actually doing it at scale until emissions are down to at least, say, a third of their current value. What we should be doing now is just learning about what works and doesn't.
And Rose, I wanted to ask you about thinking about developing country contexts, and I want to acknowledge your point that actually that's a very wide landscape, so maybe we'll narrow the conversation to thinking about Africa. Where do you see the role for carbon removal? Because on one hand, I've heard from colleagues in African countries that this is for the developed countries with all their historical emissions to figure out, that's not for us to worry about right now. On the other hand, if it does become a viable and even valuable sector, you hear people in the conference circuit saying it's $1 trillion opportunity. I wouldn't want developing countries to miss out on doing R&D for these approaches. So what have you been hearing for people, and what's your own view about that?
Yeah, it's definitely a very interesting space right now. A lot of chat, a lot of hype. But maybe I'll take the first part of your question, which is this idea that, is this technology for rich countries should deal with it? Just putting my science and technology kind of policy hat on, I think I tend to reject the idea that some technologies are for some people, not others. So I think that, climate is a global problem, and at the level of ideas, tech, I think that there should just be global engagement. We need to crowd that in, which is different from broader issues of equity and justice. And, obviously richer countries have a bigger burden of decarbonization. They should be putting more money into helping poor countries innovate, decarbonize, whatever, transition. But in terms of ideas, thinking, research, I think that should really just be a global effort. And I think that this is obviously an idea that's animating a lot of what, for example, Degrees does. Yeah, so and this whole room is agreed. But to your point about what's happening in Africa. So I think right now, carbon removal is a really messy space. So a lot of the focus has been on how Africa can monetize its natural sinks. And this has been, there's just, frankly, just shenanigans in that world. Yeah. And, it's just, it's very, very messy. And on one hand, so that's kind of a part of the carbon removal space that I treat with a lot of skepticism. The other kind of maybe permanent space, there is activity, there are startups, what I see is, I think it's important that there's some activity, that there's some engagement on these ideas in Africa, but so that you're right, so that you're kind of building the foundation and have some kind of a foot in the door for something that could be part of the global future. But the red flags that I see and other people are flagging are, just hype and false claims, especially, there are a lot of people selling a vision of we'll remove carbon, we'll increase farmer yields, we'll do all of this, blah, blah, blah. And I think that can be quite disingenuous. I think I tend to want to caution care with that because we're still in experimentation learning. And I think that if activities are really at that level and are framed and packaged as such, then I think that you have trust and credibility and integrity in the system. I think a lot of people are worried about exploitation, which we've seen from the mainstream carbon removal space that could spill over, and I think that's something that there should be a lot of care. The biggest worry I hear on the ground is just distraction. People are worried that this is a distraction, that we have bigger fish to fry, and if resources and time and energy is going into this. So I still see this as a very small piece of the puzzle. I'm less worried about distraction, but I agree with the tendency among a lot of decision makers to not pay this a lot of attention because they just need to work on other stuff.
I mean, thinking a little bit about carbon removal in the developing world, I think in the near term, absolutely. And the level of hype and nonsense, I think the CDR carbon removal startup ecosystem is sort of manifestly unhelpful and unfit for purpose in lots of ways. But I think there is this interesting long-term possibility. If you think that large-scale carbon removal will get driven a lot by solar and wind with high capacity factors, if you imagine this really is happening seriously after 2050, when we hope there's been a lot of development in the poor world, and if you believe the justice argument that the people who ought to pay for the carbon burden are the people who, the ancestors, the people who put the carbon in the air, then I think there is some interesting possibility that it's a big industry where money flows from the north to the south to build these things. Obviously, there's got to be controls and problems, and exploitation's an issue, but I think it gives a potential for a high-wage real industry that
yeah,
scale.
and we're seeing a bit of this. So in Kenya, where I'm from, there's, we have abundant geothermal, we have the right geology, and so there is a little bit of a movement of capital to explore that. It's still super early days, but if people are throwing money around at this, I'm like, yeah, bring some to Kenya, sure. Let's get a piece of the action. So and from a siting perspective, it's a part of the world that could make sense to site this if this ever becomes a thing. So I think I agree with that.
I think that there's a lot this SRM field can learn about carbon removal right now, but I want to move on for the sake of time to thinking about adaptation, because I don't think we talk enough about adaptation in general or the interactions. We have a lot of conversations about mitigation deterrence. I'm also very concerned about adaptation deterrence. Some people would say that, we're already choosing adaptation or a combination of suffering and adaptation through our failure to actively choose mitigation. And I wanted to start with you, Rose. What do you think are the limits to adaptation? And also, do you think that SRM should be seen as a form of adaptation? And what do you think about the potential of redefining it that way?
Yeah. I'll take the first easier question first, and then I'll take it from there. Yeah, so I think, they are what I see as kind of social, physical, and financial limits to adaptation. Socially, I think, again, back to this distribution point that keeps coming up in Justice Point, that, the most vulnerable are who are most likely to suffer most and who have the least adaptive capacity. So an example I've been giving a lot is if you're in Phoenix, Arizona, your adaptive capacity and your ability to kind of manage extreme heat, humidity is different from Africa. So I think the adaptation question and has this social limit where we're not managing to protect the most vulnerable. And this has been the subject of many an IPCC kind of COP debate. So that's this one, social. I think I worry about physical constraint limits. So I think it's possible that we are going to face impacts in our physical systems that really surpass our ability to adapt effectively. So I worry about that, which is part of why I'm in this discussion. I'm not from the SRM space, but I'm increasingly interested in climate risk because of this kind of are there physical limits? Because I come from this mitigation adaptation world, and I'm curious about that. And then obviously financial limits. So this is going to be very expensive, and then that ties back to this distribution question and equity and all that. So I think those are limits I'm worried about. I don't know if should I get into the second part, or should we have David talk about it?
Go for it.
Let's see.
So I find it's an interesting question, and I think I liked the discussion about this yesterday also on the plenary, but I do think that SRM obviously bears some conceptual resemblance to adaptation, and I can see the temptation to want to link them. So obviously, if you bring down global average temperatures, you could blunt some of the worst impacts: sea level rise, ice melting, blah, blah. So I can see there's kind of they're siblings in a way. But I think that the differences are significant, despite this conceptual resemblance. One is, I think, adaptation is very local. You're doing things very, very locally, and there's kind of this really, you're building seawalls, planting drought resistance crops. It's a very local activity, and SRM has got these three features that I find interesting. One, I think it's kind of this high leverage thing where small physical inputs can have big effects. And I think, David, you might fight me on this. I think there's high uncertainty, definitely at the local impacts level, which is kind of different from adaptation. And finally, it has this global entanglement, which makes it more politically, kind of ethically fraught. And I think, and for this reason, I think scientifically and politically should be its own category, despite this conceptual kind of contact between the two.
I agree. I mean, I think one of the core things I think is that there really are four fundamental categories of things humans can do about climate risk: decarbonization, carbon removal, solar reflection or sunlight reflection, and adaptation. And there's lots of subcategories in them, but I don't think you can lump either of those sensibly. There's no way that you can do that and kind of preserve the deep differences between them. I'd say of those four, adaptation is the only one I've never worked on, done kind of substantive real work on, so I have probably less coherent to say. I think that the possibilities for humans to reduce their impacts, I think humans' ability to adapt may, I think, be bigger than people sometimes think. I think in Bangladesh, for example, there was this cyclone around 1970 that was maybe the biggest natural disaster of the last century, killed of order 500,000 people. And there were some cyclones that were bigger storm surges in this century that killed more like 1,000 or less people, and that was a combination of these refuges and cell phone warnings and a bunch of different adaptive things that really dramatically reduced the harms. And I think there may be more possibility for that, although it's not been done well. But I do think it's important to say that adaptation doesn't work for the natural world. And I think rightly mostly talk in this room about risk to humans, and risk to humans are maybe number one. But I think, even though it's unfashionable, I think it is important to say that many of us care a lot about the unmanaged natural world in ways that aren't just about its utility to humans, but its own value. And the natural world is particularly vulnerable and unadaptable, and it's the combination of climate change and the land and habitat fragmentation, the appropriation of land from nature. Those together are this giant natural impact that adaptation can't address meaningfully.
Let's take a few minutes to come more to SRM before we open it up for audience questions. So we had these couple of questions about how we communicate this. The majority of people, make sure to say, as we heard many times in this conference already, that mitigation is our first priority. We can't allow SRM to impact or slow action on mitigation. That was pretty clear. And also people, mostly, although not all, indicated that, when they say this, that's how they really feel, right? So people are enthusiastic about that. About a third are conflicted. So David, I wanted to ask you, you've suggested in a prior conversation that in a purely utilitarian sense, the right thing to do might actually be to decarbonize more slowly. Can you explain the thinking behind that for us?
I mean, if, and that's an if you as a human or a political leader or whatever think that the pace of decarbonization, whatever each of you think is the right pace of decarbonization, if you are thinking about that is some balance between the cost of decarbonization and the risk of climate change, whatever you think about interest rates or discounting or the costs, if you just think that there's some trade-off between those, that you're somehow choosing decarbonization speed based on climate risk, then if something reduces climate risk, whatever it is rational under that framework or ethically correct to decarbonize more slowly. And that's pretty basic to any kind of utilitarian conception of climate policy. Now, there are other rights-based conceptions that might see it differently. I think it's possible to construct ways where and there's maybe reasons that decarbonization should happen have nothing to do with climate. But I think if decarbonization is for climate and you have any kind of utilitarian framing, it's pretty hard to escape the fact that if SRM reduces net risks, even if it has side effects and risks, which it certainly does, you should decarbonize more slowly. So I think this is where this conversation about moral hazard is very confused. I think there is an absolute risk that fossil fuel entities, oil companies, oil-rich nations will exploit the idea of SRM and try and get out of decarbonization. I think that is certain to happen. I really worry a lot that if SRM gets going and looks like it's working pretty well, no obvious giant problems, that we will slacken too much the pace of decarbonization or give up on CDR for a while. But I do think it's important to just think through it, because we all say, yeah, I guess the one thing, like Pascal Lamy said, not a substitute and should never be considered as such. And I get why it's rhetorically effective to say that, but I don't see that it's actually a thing one can say in the kind of normal framing of public policy. If you're going to say that, you have to have some other justification for emissions cuts.
Rose, where do you land on this?
Yeah, I see what you're saying, David, but I guess, I do find sometimes the rhetorical corner that everyone's backed into can be unhelpful, where it's an impossible, the research knowledge has to be perfect to have governance, and the governance has to be perfect to have deployment, and then it's chicken and egg, and then also we can't all of this, and we can never do this. Rhetorically, I can see it's complicated, but I think more politically, and I think at the political level, whatever makes more sense, it's not helpful because we're not these top-down arbiters of what happens, and decisions are really decentralized. And this idea that we can choose to slow or not slow, whatever, kind of assumes a level of control that we don't have. And so how I see it is, right now, decarbonization is a priority, keep doing it. We're not decarbonizing at pace, and so I think that the political window for where SRM could or could not come in could change, but I think that we're really led by this kind of messy political process. And I think the researchers and the kind of policy people can kind of produce framing, use knowledge to create framing, but you set up these different scenarios and these different options. It's important to broaden the aperture of what kind of options we put out and not just be backed into one thing, but then you have to just surrender to a complicated kind of contest of ideas and interlocking interests.
Yeah, I mean, really well said. Of course, there's no arbiter of the global utilitarian good, and it's this local fight. And I think there is this kind of bizarre rhetorical corner where people are really saying we should cut emissions 50% in 5 or 8 years, which would be this incredible impact on especially the developing world. And I think we need to find a way out of that rhetorical corner to something that's more realistic about the trade-offs. One other thing I wanted to say was about the ordering of them. Just to say that I think if you ask people the preference order, we didn't quite ask this in these questions, but if you ask the preference order, my guess is most people would say decarbonization, adaptation, maybe carbon removal, maybe we should think about someday sunlight reflection. That's a kind of typical preference order. Fair enough. But people often jump from that preference order to think that that's the time order, that the right time order is we first focus on plan A, and then if it fails, plan B. That's a kind of that plan C wording of that movie last night. I think that's profoundly wrong. My view is that if sunlight reflection ever makes sense, which I think we can debate, there are very strong, kind of deep reasons to do with the stock and flow nature of carbon as a pollutant to say you should start early at a small level. Basically, decarbonization doesn't make much sense as wait for emergency mode. It makes sense if you start early and use it to reduce the peak. And so that means it mostly should happen before CDR, in my view. And I think there's quite a set of strong arguments for that. Again, maybe it should never happen at all, but the arguments about timing, I think, are quite deep. They have to do with this basic stock and flow dynamics, that for carbon removal, there's no immediate benefit. Carbon removal does get at the root problem. Carbon removal isn't just a Band-Aid, but it's inherently slow. It doesn't do things fast. SRM is the opposite. SRM doesn't get at the root problem. It is a Band-Aid and an imperfect one, but it doesn't do the slow one. So there's this timing thing I think is deep, and people don't grapple with it.
Let's move to some audience questions. Maybe we could just do the home slide for now, but we have a popular question about the views of the panel on current carbon credits and future cooling experimental credit schemes. Rose, why don't you start?
Oh my goodness.
You mentioned shenanigans with carbon removal.
Hopefully David has more to say on this, but I just think that like when we move into financialization and away from kind of, things get quite murky, incentives get very murky, and so I approach, as I said, a lot of these ideas with skepticism. David?
Yeah, I mean, carbon credits imply kind of project-based offsets, which I think make no sense. Or I mean, they make a lot of sense to the people who are promoting them because they make money. But I think if we're going to do large-scale carbon removal, I think it needs to get organized and financed more the way public utilities do, where there's vicious competition to supply some service under what's ultimately government control. So and I think the idea of sort of future cooling experimental credits, I don't even know what that is. Yeah.
I'm curious, though, David, in all of this with CDR, I guess somebody needs to buy, somebody needs to be the buyer, like the value has to be created somewhere. How do you see that?
They don't need to be the buyer of tons. So I think that's really important to say. For especially open ocean alkalinity, which we've been thinking of a lot, I think a ton-based scheme is really not likely to make much sense, especially in the global commons of the ocean. I think there are reasons to believe that that's one of the systems one of the carbon removal ideas that may have low environmental impacts, comparatively low costs, and be scalable. But I think if it happens, governments need to contract to have private entities to supply a certain amount of alkalinity delivered in a certain place under certain metrics and constraints, and have great competition to do that cheaply. But I think governments need to be the ones who are measuring the outcome and deciding where to do it in some way that will be imperfect but better than nothing. But I don't think a ton for ton makes sense.
And footing the bill.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's how we pay for these public utilities.
Sorry,
and footing the bill from taxes, and those taxes presumably should be raised partly on past carbon emissions.
People are also wondering about the biggest fears about potential side effects of SRM and respond to their scientific legitimacy. There's probably other also panels throughout this conference that will address that, but maybe briefly, we can start with you,
Well,
David.
I want to jump on one that I saw earlier, which is hydrological weakening. It's actually
we could talk
important.
about those together, yeah.
Yeah, it's important to say that's not a given. So it depends how sunlight reflection is done. So if you do sunlight reflection, say, to roughly cut the rate of warming in half, which is one of the ways it might be done. So this idea that we begin to add cooling of about 1/10 of a degree C per decade, that because the hydrological cycle responds roughly twice as fast on global average, say for cyclone intensity, as does temperature, that actually leaves global average precip about the same. So it stops it increasing, but it doesn't decrease it. So it's not necessarily true that you decrease it. You're going to certainly make local changes for sure, but it's not axiomatically true that you decrease it.
Sorry. I can't quite see the screen.
No, well, the question is the biggest fears about potential side effects of SRM and their scientific legitimacy. Are there fears that you wonder about or that you have?
Yeah, so I just, and I'm somebody who is on the out, so I'm not an SRM researcher. I sit at the boundary. I'm more from the kind of mainstream energy and climate world. So my view is from the outside, and I my sense is that I would like from this group is who I want to answer this question for me, actually. This is your job, literally, to do the science and to clarify these questions and to kind of roll up some kind of narrative that can be taken to the outside that tell us that this is the overall direction of travel, these are the big picture trade-offs, and maybe it's not possible, maybe there's, I don't know. So I've sat in a lot of SRM impacts research presentations, and thanks to degrees, I've listened to a lot of research presentations from around the globe. Literally, you have global representation, and as kind of, I'm a scientist, but not in the space. So I'm kind of, as an outsider listening to these scientific presentations, the kind of TLDR seems to be, there'll be some good impacts here and some good impacts there. And what I mean? It's very difficult for an outsider to roll this up into a coherent narrative. So I think that is for you guys to kind of do the research, do the work, package the kind of, the insight that can form the basis for people outside to decide.
I have two quick examples. One is, I think there's a kind of surprisingly little talk in the SRM community about the air pollution impacts of adding sulfate aerosols to the stratosphere. To me, that's kind of, in a way, impact number one, in the sense that sulfur air pollution is the biggest single environmental killer that humans have ever done. Just gigantic. And so if you're talking about adding more aerosols, to me, that like the first thing you should think about is that those aerosols will harm people on the ground. It may not actually be very big. Daniele Vizione showed me some new research, working on new research that indicates it may be quite small, but it feels like that ought to be, to me, a natural first-order concern. And yet often it's hardly mentioned. Like I was looking at the SRM 360 website that had a list of concerns that wasn't even there. I think that's an odd one, whereas there's a lot of concern on the other side that you see expressed about changes in weather or even weather predictability, which I don't think there's really any papers that support that idea. So there's this sort of weird disconnects, I think, between at least the way I see some of the most obvious risks of SRM and what I think is out there.
So we have this question that was also popular. SRM is not a substitute for mitigation. Is mitigation a substitute for SRM, as various speakers have implied at this conference?
Right. So
I'll read it again. SRM is not a substitute for mitigation. Is mitigation a substitute for SRM, as various speakers have implied at this conference?
Well, I don't recall any speaker saying that, so I can't speak to the latter part of the question. I don't want to seem to be endorsing the view that many speakers said that at this conference. It seems unlikely, but I don't know. No, obviously mitigation is like these are separate categories.
I think I have a two-letter answer for that. No. I mean, if it's sort of basic to the stock and flow nature of the climate problem, that if humans want a stable climate, net emissions, which certainly includes mitigation, have to get to zero. We can argue about when, but that's just a fact of math. So I don't think there's a way that SRM gets you out of that.
Yeah. Well, I think the question here is, can mitigation do what SRM could do? And maybe, or is there somebody in the room who asked the question that would prefer to paraphrase it better?
If you at any point want the world to be cooler than it is at the point you make the decision, you must do either SRM or CDR or a combination, because emissions cuts doesn't do that.
I mean, possibly if we started decarbonizing rapidly, like decades and decades ago, I guess, but.
Also, an important question, you mentioned finance, Rose, and this questioner said, direct financial aid from north to south seems politically infeasible for now. Are there other options like technology transfer that could address inequity tractably?
So, all of this stuff helps. So the technology transfer helps. All of this stuff helps. But at the end of the day, the real binding constraint is the financing, and there are many ways to get at the financing that is not just a direct transfer. There's a lot of the cost of capital is high. The way we rate the credit ratings of these poor countries, the way we can de-risk, we can guarantee. There are many different ways that you can get at the finance problem. People are even talking about debt forgiveness in other domains that kind of help the problem. So it's not just like a direct financial transfer, but so there's a lot you can do even in the realm of finance, but I think the realm of finance is just an investment is inescapable.
Another question. This one's from David LePage. Mitigation efforts have multiple benefits, like improving agricultural outcomes or reducing energy costs. Are there any SRM technologies that would have co-benefits?
Co-benefit, so a side benefit. I'm sure, but hard to think. I mean, hard to figure. So the only SRM technology that feels like there's a real development path that we understand enough is stratospheric aerosols, I think. The other ones may be better, but we don't have a development path that is sort of, you could execute with current science. I can't really think of a co-benefit that's interesting. I think there's obviously benefits and risks to climate. It's important to say that mitigation isn't all co-benefits. There's both. There are lots of benefits, obviously, to mitigation, but there's harms too, and there's environmental consequences of different decarbonization technologies that are real.
Yeah, lots of trade-offs, and maybe I'll just add to say something that's really important is just coherence in problem statement and what you're trying to solve for. I think there's a temptation to want to package things as doing very many things, and so we'll educate women and remove carbon and do this and do that and do that. You know what I mean? And that makes a story stronger. But I think what we're learning, and I think this is a big conversation in the U.S. right now, is like when the left try to over-optimize for everything. But I think in this space, it's really important to maintain discipline and coherence.
Really well said. I think this is crucial. I think there's a way in which this community has done. I'll just be restating what you said. Tried to have all the bells and whistles that are all socially valuable, but if humans get things done, some kind of focus and discipline is crucial.
Oh, I'll say one last thing I forgot to say in the adaptation section. This is super, super important. If in very poor countries, the most important thing you can do in terms of adaptation is poverty reduction, is making people less poor. And so I think that's kind of, that is just like a win-win-win-win-win everywhere, and so there's no conflict. It doesn't conflict with, it's just a good thing. So I think for, just to recall this idea of like the ultimate generator of co-benefits is poverty reduction, but that's also something that we should be doing anyway.
I don't want to give up on direct aid from north to south. Obviously, the U.S. situation is terrible, but I think that these justice arguments mean something, and there are ways that I have some hope that we can still have substantial direct transfers.
So I want to bundle two questions that might seem unrelated, but I think there's a connection. One is the popular question, what is a workable international governance arrangement for SRM? Then we also had the question, do you think women are empowered in SRM, which is largely dominated by male voices, and what are you doing to empower them? So there's a question about who gets to make decisions and shape the space.
Okay, maybe I'll take the second one first, and then we can ping pong. Yeah, so I think what I find, and I'm somebody who's spent my entire career in very male-dominated spaces, and the common theme has been highly technical spaces. So it's kind of like a spillover from underrepresentation of women in STEM, and this is like a highly technical field, and it's changing. So I really believe a lot of power and decision making comes from this kind of the expert class that actually kind of is the backing of the very symbolic leaders. And so I think I've always been a strong believer in like diversifying this research community, and in SRM, the research community is most of the community, and so there are a lot of PIs here, there are a lot of funders. I think just trying to like recruit and kind of recruit in ways that kind of build diversity in these ranks will kind of flow upwards.
It obviously is unequal now. I think one of the questions that's worth asking is how unequal it is, say, in gender representation compared to other climate fields. There may be good research that's done it. My student Jen Dye, at one point as a side thing, did do a kind of calculation of that based on papers and other things. And I don't remember the exact answers, but more or less the answer is it looked like both in north-south representation of which countries were publishing and in gender balance of publishing, it was kind of like climate science, which is unequal, but I think that's the relevant metric, not perfect equality. And I think for climate sciences inequality, there's lots of reasons, but part of it is a kind of frozen-in thing. When I think there really has been social change, profound change, in people who are 20s and 30s. The problem is you have a bunch of dinosaurs like me who haven't retired yet, and once we go, the next group will be much more diverse than us.
Yeah, and maybe just, I agree with that, but maybe if we also broaden the types of questions, I don't know, Holly, you think about this too, because there are kind of certain types of like, some of the kind of very physics, very like intense. I think there's ways that you can also crowd in different perspectives by also opening up the kinds of questions that kind of bring in diverse set of researchers that are interested in other parts of the question and not like a very kind of narrow kind of physics approach to the question. In terms of governance, I think yeah, I'm on a different panel later today about that. I'm not sure if I have the heart to tackle it right now. To be honest, I just think that sometimes I'm not sure if this approach to this maximal approach to governance, that we need some new UN, some global guy. I think going down that road has taken us some distance in the mainstream climate conversation, but has a lot of limitations. So my sense is still early days. My sense is that like as the knowledge and research and understanding of the field matures, I think that we will have to reach beyond this traditional global governance model and be more creative. So that's another research question. I think that maybe we might be prematurely backing this field into a corner that's locked into some legacy sense of what governance looks like. So that's kind of as much as I can say now.
I think of it as sort of two tracks. I think that the kind of UN, IPCC, UN FCCC track, I think that's actually very important for getting people to talk and debate and having this kind of global reach. I think it's very unlikely that that track, obviously it's a lot of complicated internal tracks, will kind of deliver an answer about sunlight reflection. But I think that doesn't make it unimportant. It's still the way a bunch of conversations that need to happen. I think if you run the tape backwards, if some fairy comes to me from the future and says, SRM was deployed in 2035 or 40 or whatever, how do we get there? I think if that happens, almost certainly it didn't happen because there was some kind of very large UN consensus to do it. I think it happens because some set of countries decide to do it, and whether that is stable or not depends crucially on the set of countries, how they bring it forward, what they do. And remember, countries are not the only actors. NGOs are profoundly important, as are businesses in this field, and there's complicated ways that civil society can shape this. So I think it's possible to imagine imperfect but stable deployments, politically stable and environmentally stable deployments that involve a relatively small number of countries, but it's also possible to imagine disasters. And I think it's very hard to know which way it goes.
I'll ask two more questions. I think we might be at time soon. One is this popular question: what's your advice to early career researchers who are worried about the optics of SRM on their future career prospects? And then we also had a question for you, Rose, about what can we learn from sustainable development when thinking about integrating SRM into a portfolio? So maybe I'll give you time to think about it, and we'll do the career advice question first.
I think it's a good topic. It's a global topic. And I mean, forgetting whether it ever matters in the real world, intellectually it's a fun topic because there's so much argumentation and different views and the way it cuts across. And I would say in pure careers terms, maybe I'll actually call out Tony Harding, who's on a personal note, is somewhere here, because that's a sense that there really are jobs, because Tony is the student of Juan Moreno Cruz, who was my PhD student, who was, I think, one of the very first PhDs on SRM. And so there's already now a second generation or third generation, depending on where you count, who has a faculty job in this topic. And there's lots more, but that's one example of already I guess counting me as one, the third generation, and there's people beyond. I mean, there's advisors of mine. So.
Yeah, and interesting. I had a personal experience. Possibly even in the middle of a personal experience with this, where I'm not an early career, but I'm from the mainstream climate world, and engaging in this world it comes with a lot of it's a penalty, because there's like a lot of people misunderstand it. They're not sure about it, but I think that I'm interested in illuminating knowledge frontiers. I think it's important that, you know, taboo on knowledge for me is just wrong. And this is part of what this motivated me, that there's some knowledge frontier that mainstream climate is not paying attention, and that there's interesting, you know, there's something of interest that we should be learning, that we should be attentive to. And so I think that if you're curious, if you really, really want to illuminate dark corners, if you want to be part of kind of adding to our stock of knowledge, just be grounded in that, I think, very honorable mission. And it's an important mission. And then I think the second thing is, if you can situate your work in the broader picture. I think often sometimes when you're in some frontier, you can be have blinders on, and all you see is a frontier, and all you talk about, and then you have such a poor sense of where you fit in the whole. So I think how you mitigate against this, I think sometimes like people in this community come off wrong or rub off wrong, because more could be done to situate it in the big picture. So just make sure you're always looking beyond what you're working on.
Just say, I mean, you're absolutely right that there's still, of course, controversy and risk to this career, the risk to any careers, but I think it's important to say, on pure careerist basis for young researchers, there's a fair number of jobs. People are hiring in NGOs and in government on this topic. For academic jobs, you know, ETH is now hiring a major professorship. We at UChicago are trying to hire 10 faculty in this area, broad area. There's really a fair amount happening. So I think, I mean, careerism shouldn't be everything, but obviously it matters. It's easy for me to say as an older guy who's doing well, but I think there's lots of room in academia and civil society organizations and in government for people working on these topics.
Yeah. Do we have time for this?
I did want to hear, because it's a specific question for you and your expertise,
So
the lessons from sustainable development.
So what SRM can learn from sustainable development? I guess, oh gosh, this is something to think about. Maybe what I'll say is, in sustainable development, one thing I've learned, especially coming from more of a science background and going to development background, is that this kind of dance between evidence, people, political systems, and I think that just managing that balance is something that SRM can learn, not just from development, but from mainstream climate. I think that SRM is still very much weighted towards the science and the research, and I think that there are blind spots in how you manage these other parts of the ecosystem from which decisions emerge. And so in development, there've been the economists who have their grand theories of how growth or whatever happens. There are civil practitioners on the ground who have their own view. There's also tensions between natural ecosystems and people, and there's just been it's been a balancing act that has not been perfected. But I think that the sustainable development community has had long experience balancing across these domains, and I think the SRM space is very, very early in that, and has not really broken out of the science. It's kind of the equivalent of the economic theory first approach to sustainable development. And so I think there's a lot to be done to explore these other kind of counterbalancing factors that the SRM space should be aware of.
Yeah. I mean, I think sustainable development was a really successful frame, you had this deep consensus process to reach global goals with all of these stakeholders. There might be
and I think
something to learn.
To David's goal, there's also, I think there's like an interesting interaction between what is happening at this big global macro governance level and what's happening on the ground. So what countries are doing, what is happening subnational, and to David's point that there is value. So these global goals, criticize them as you will, as what do they achieve, blah, blah, blah. They set the agenda, they set a vision, they set a North Star, they create consensus, they bring new ideas. So energy, for example, by being inserted into SDG, became a focal point after being on the edges of the development space. So I think it is important to have this big global, to take advantage of these big global governance structures and consensus building structures. But then but that also kind of is in balance with all of these like sub-global and different kind of governance and decision-making processes.
And last rapid Q ambush question. We've been talking about this for many years, but people are still wondering if we don't call it SRM, as has been recommended for good reasons, what should we call it?
I've, in the last little while, sort of moved to sunlight reflection. Ben Peltz, we hired as to help us do communications. I think he helped to convince me, and I can sort of use it as a verb, because you talk about reflecting sunlight, but it still preserves the SRM, but I don't think the name matters that much. Instead, I'm going to say that I think there's a lot of talk here that it's likely to happen. I'm much more skeptical. I think the underlying dynamics are that it is the political risk of starting is concentrated. It's concentrated in a small place in decision makers who start, and that risk is big, and the benefits are diffuse and slow moving. And so I think, despite all the talk, despite all of you, I think the probability of it happening is not very big, at least in the range I can see.
Rose, help us, what should we call it? And also any final thoughts?
Actually, we were at dinner yesterday. I think Jessica said and suggested it should sunlight roses. Actually, she said the R should stand for roses. It should just be happy. And I don't remember what we came up for M. I'm not sure. I don't know if the name, I know, the current name is not helping, but I think that the kind of quote-unquote ick factor, the fear factor, is less connected to the actual name than to this idea of deliberate action, man playing God. I think like whatever you call it, like if sunlight reflection is better than, you don't have radiation, but it's still, it doesn't get away from at the core, this has fear, and this kind of touches something in our kind of deep in our human psyche. So I don't know what the solution to that is, but time, a lot of ideas that are difficult get normalized over time. But this is a long play for this field, where this is super early days, and maybe there'll be a name if and when we get there.
I don't think there is or should be a linguistic solution.
Okay, well, hopefully this doesn't dissuade linguists from joining the research community.
Oh.
Well, please join me in thanking the panelists, and thanks to all of you for participating.